And from Sweden, we moved to Norway and to explore the case of Norwegian wind power. Marte Skogen, a PhD candidate from the University of Bergen. She's interested, or you're interested, in public opinion and political representation on climate and morality issues. And in your PhD project, you investigate attitudes towards renewable energy. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you very much for having me. My name is Marte. As was mentioned, I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Comparative Politics in Bergen, so I'm a political scientist. I was very sorry to miss yesterday's session. I think it all sounds very relevant for the topics I will now cover in this talk, because my dissertation is mostly on really understanding attitudes towards renewable energy, and in particular, wind power. So that is what I will speak about today. I will not go so much to the local level. I will stay quite on the public, using mostly survey data to see how public opinion has really developed over time, before I delve a bit deeper into the determinants and show you a bit of my recent research, looking at how some of these distributional concerns might affect citizen support of wind power and renewable energy in general. So a brief reminder before we start of Norway's situations when it comes to wind energy. Norway has mostly or almost 100% renewable electricity. This has for a long time come largely from hydropower, and it is not until the recent decade or two that we've actually seen a growth also in wind power. We saw quite rapid expansion of onshore wind, which, as I'm sure has been mentioned yesterday, led to quite a bit of opposition. So by looking at data now over time, we will try to map out quite descriptively, that being said, what might have caused this plummeting in support. Norway has great wind conditions not only on shore but also offshore, and so the Norwegian government announced quite ambitious plans to develop also an offshore wind industry, both floating and bottom-fixed offshore wind. And so there are plans to allocate areas up to 30 gigawatts offshore wind by 2040. However, you could say, especially perhaps in the public opinion, this has been something in the future, and it is not really until the last couple of years that you start seeing some proliferations. Norway don't have any big offshore wind projects as of now, more prototypes and plans. So we will look more into the development over time now as we look into public opinion. To do so, we are very lucky to have data from the Norwegian Citizen Panel. The Norwegian Citizen Panel is an online survey panel which is collected multiple times a year. We have a representative sample of the Norwegian population answering these surveys multiple times a year, and it has been going for quite a while now. So we have actually asked questions about wind power, both onshore and offshore, going as far back as to 2014. There are some differences in the wordings, but most of the questions are as follows. To what degree do you agree or disagree with the following statement? More onshore wind power should be developed in Norway, and more offshore wind power should be developed in Norway. The respondents have then been given the option to answer on a scale from 1 to 7, so from strongly disagree to strongly agree, with a neutral point in the middle. And what I will now show you is really, putting together the shares that to some degree agree and to some degree disagree, to see how these shares have really developed over time. So what we have here behind me is a timeline, you could say, really showing how public opinion has developed throughout our rounds with the Norwegian Citizen Panel. The question was first asked in 2014. In 2014, we were still quite early on with wind power in Norway in general. Like I said, we had a lot of experience with hydropower, which was contentious at this time, at its own time. But now when we started in 2014, we had not yet seen so much proliferation of wind farms in Norway. You had projects, but still not anything near what we see today. So in 2014, we see here in both the stippled lighter blue line on top and also the darker green just below, that support for both onshore wind in green and offshore wind in blue was relatively high. We see actually that as much as 81% of the population supported development of offshore wind in Norway, and also 72% of the population supported the development of onshore wind, or at least they agreed with the statement that we should develop more. I can also mention that we have error lines around here, so we have 95% confidence intervals to see the error margins around the estimates. In 2014, we see also that opposition was low, so you didn't have a lot of, you had more neutral citizens, did not have a lot of contestation. Because you did not have a lot of contestation in 2014 and the years that followed, the question wasn't really relevant to ask, or wasn't seen as being relevant to ask, until we jump all the way forward to 2019. As most people in this room, from Norway at least, might be aware of, between 2014 and 2019, a lot happened in terms of wind power in Norway. Actually, as much as 557 wind turbines started production between the start of 2014 and the end of 2019. So what is it we see happening between these lines? We see that support for onshore wind, which was once at just about 72%, goes quite drastically down to just about 50% of the population supporting onshore wind development. This leads to a lot of the municipalities having these wind projects, objecting, so to say, or stating their opposition, and new concessions were paused after feedback, really. A lot of feedback concerned really, although we will talk a bit more about this after, concerned that the process had gone too rapid and that really it hadn't been transparent enough, the communication hasn't been clear enough. And we saw also that the outcomes of these processes, so the wind parks that were built, they did not really mirror the expectations that were set before these projects started development. What we see that also I find interesting is that between 2014 and 2019, despite seeing that support for onshore wind drops, we see that support for offshore wind actually stays rather high. We see that still approximately 80% of the population supports offshore wind development. Again, offshore wind is still quite of a future thing. It's not something that has really seen as happening in the now. And then for a couple of years after, we see that the development, you have a slight decline going into 2021 as well. When we come to 2022, the Norwegian government also announces big ambitions when it comes to offshore wind development. So now offshore wind development, although it has been spoken about before and there have been some plans, this is really when it's put on the public agenda. This is when a lot of normal citizens, so to say, really hear more about this. At this point, concession procedures are also reopened for onshore wind development. And so we will zoom a bit in on the last couple of years, starting here in 2023. Like I said, now offshore wind is also on the agenda, and this is also when we first start seeing that support for offshore wind development starts dropping. Looking from 2023 to 2025, we see that when we come to 2025, we see that support for onshore wind is now down at 32%. And perhaps as significantly, we see that opposition is also quite high, or at least a quite large share of Norwegians disagree that we should develop more onshore wind in Norway. But now we also see that offshore wind between 2024 and 2025, we've actually come to the point of only, you could say, 44.7% of the Norwegian public supporting offshore wind development, which is a quite drastic decline from the 80% that we saw in 2014. So what has really happened in these years? Well, the Norwegian debate when it comes to energy transitions and wind power in particularly has really been centered on costs when it comes to offshore wind. There has been talks about electricity prices. A lot of Norwegians experiences or rather fearing higher electricity prices due to also connections to the rest of Europe. But also the need for subsidies and once again, whether or not this will actually be profitable in the end. Because a lot of the offshore wind development in Norway is, like I said, floating turbines, which are without a doubt expensive to develop. I wanted to have a brief look at the more disaggregated results as well for this is 2025. You can see the most recent data here was collected this spring. I want to really highlight what is interesting about wind power in Norway is that it's one thing that you see a lot of opposition, both at the local and here, as you see, at the public level. But it is quite polarized, and for a long time it has been quite polarized. If you define polarization as there being a quite high number of citizens being opposed, but also a quite high number of citizens being quite supportive. You don't have a lot of neutral citizens. When you see at the top the distribution for answers when it comes to offshore wind, we see that about 20% of the population strongly disagrees that we need more offshore wind or should develop more offshore wind in Norway. But you also have a quite high share of Norwegians somewhat agreeing, right? So you have this almost bimodal distribution, you could say. This is also how it used to look for onshore wind, but in 2025 we see that what used to be a quite polarized, contested issue now is actually just, you could say it's actually plainly just overwhelmingly opposed. You do have variation, of course, but still you don't have the same sense of polarization, you have more opposition. And then I wanted to speak a bit about the determinants before going into this recent research I talked about. Of course, the determinants of this development in Norway is complex and I won't be able to cover it all, but I do think it is worth mentioning these three overarching themes that we really see in the research on both local and public acceptance of wind power in Norway. First, we do see that the way this process has happened, both when it comes to communication and transparency, but also to perhaps accountability and predictability in terms of how the projects look like versus what they were promised to be, has mattered a lot in Norway. Citizens perceive that the way these processes has happened are not just. They're perceived as unfair. We can talk a lot about distribution of both costs and benefits, and this is related to also the landscape and environmental impacts, where we see that a lot of the negative externalities in terms of cost, whether that is impact on landscape or economic costs, are seen as being high for the local communities and the Norwegian population in general. This comes also down to whether it's workplaces, whether you see these materialize, tax benefits, and so forth. It is important, of course, with this landscape and environmental impacts. We do often talk about Norwegians being very much happy to spend time in nature and so on. And so especially when you've had problems, you could say, in the process of the turbines often becoming bigger than maybe the population thought they would be, that you really do see this environmental impacts as being, important to begin with, but perhaps exaggerated when you don't really have a good communication throughout these processes of how the changes will actually happen. And I do think it's worth mentioning as well, it was mentioned just now, the landscape and environmental impacts are also quite integrated to these indigenous rights and this perceptions of green colonialism, right? So you change the landscape, but you also do have economic impacts on the indigenous population or the Sami population in Norway. My recent research looks a bit more at the public level at the distribution of benefits and costs, you could say, but more specifically looking at how different ownership models and how use of the generated electricity is used and how this affects public support. In Norway, a lot of the public debate, as mentioned, has been concerned with the economic costs, but also in terms of onshore wind, who the owners of these wind farms are. Norway, as mentioned, has a long tradition with hydropower, but a lot of this hydropower has been publicly owned, or at least Norwegian owned. And there has been this view of hydropower as being somewhat a public good, leading to lower electricity prices for not only consumers, but also business and so on. And so a lot of the public debates has been centered on who are the owners, how will the electricity be used, and so on, which all leads back to these perceived aspects of whether or not this is distributional just, especially concerning when seen in relation to the negative externalities for nature and wildlife and so on. So what I have really wanted to do is that I wanted to, for starters, look into the role of ownership and use of electricity, but also as a political scientist, more interested in broader trends, you could say, and broader attitudes. I wanted to see whether or not preferences that we do see in, for example, Norway, but also other countries such as Sweden, citizens preferring, public or local ownership, whether or not this is at all related to broader ideological preferences when it comes to anti-transnationalism, and you could say economic nationalism in terms of economic protectionism and so on. So what I have done is that I have fielded a survey experiment, which really just means that I have distributed scenarios to respondents in 4 different countries. I have not only distributed in Norway, I've also distributed in Great Britain, France, and Germany. And I've asked them about their opinion on building more renewable energy in their country. To really see how they react differently to different ownership models and intended uses of electricity, I have varied the information given in terms of whether you will have, for example, a state enterprise owning the infrastructure, local ownership, private national businesses, or foreign businesses. I've also varied between seeing that the electricity will be exported, whether it will be used domestically, or whether, as a baseline, the most realistic scenario you could say, whether it will be used domestically and exported, right? So both. And then I've asked them to what extent they actually agree that we should build more renewable energy. That being said, 1/3 of the sample has gotten asked about renewable energy, 1/3 about near-shore offshore wind, and 1/3 about onshore. So I will show you the aggregated results for renewables and wind power here. Descriptively, there are some quite clear trends, and these also really hold up looking at more inferential studies, the more complicated regression analysis. That is the next step. We see quite consistently in all these 4 countries that support is lower when you have foreign owners than if you have either state ownership, local ownership, or private national companies owning the infrastructures. We do actually see, perhaps surprisingly, that there is not that much variation, though, between state ownership, local ownership, private national. I do think it is worth looking at, however, Norway in the end here, where we do see that opposition towards foreign ownership is substantively higher than in the countries we compare with here. Surprisingly, in Norway as well, despite having a tradition for perhaps state ownership, we see the differences are not so big whether or not it's a private company or a state-owned company owning, really indicating that perhaps this is not as much a left-right problem as really being a thing of it being ours versus someone else's, of foreigners, or however you want to name it. We see a kind of similar trend looking at the use of electricity. Again, looking at Norway, Norway is a bit of an outlier compared to the country we compare with, Great Britain, Germany, and France. In all 4 countries, we see that support is somewhat lower when you say that the electricity will simply be exported. But perhaps interestingly, and you can say at a positive note, we see that when we do mention that some of the electricity will be used domestically and some will be exported, support is higher. Although again, Norway, once again, the overall baseline support is lower for renewable energy in Norway. Lastly, just comparing a bit between citizens' support for nearshore wind, onshore wind, and renewables. We've already seen data from the Norwegian Citizens Panel, but here looking at this latest analysis, also in comparison to the other countries, we do see that, not surprisingly, support is higher when you talk about renewables and energy, renewable energy in general. This really comes down to perhaps most citizens not being outright climate skeptics. You have relatively high support often for this general idea of renewable energy. But when it comes to onshore or offshore wind, for that matter, when you talk about concretes, you see more opposition. Within Norway, 51% of citizens uttering opposition towards onshore wind when you say that you intend to export the generated electricity. And then I also mentioned that I had a broader aim, really, of seeing whether or not these preferences were driven by broader ideological attitudes. And I won't go too nitty-gritty into the results, which are rather technical. But the findings are quite consistent. Across all these 4 countries, you do see that having preferences for economic protectionism tends to be a driver for this opposition towards foreign ownership, for example. But actually also to some degree, the other forms of ownership or the other kinds of electricity uses. So you see, if you have more economic protectionist attitudes, you will also tend to be a bit more opposed towards renewable energy in general, which really aligns with what we know about how people's attitudes align amongst political dimensions. Norway is a bit of an outlier, however, in the way economic protectionism and especially resource protectionism seems to really condition this opposition towards foreign ownership and also exports. When you do mention this, you do see citizens moving from being, might be supportive if you have local ownership or state ownership. But when you have foreign ownership, especially citizens holding these economic protectionist preferences, will be quite opposed when you introduce foreign ownership and export. So in total, the Norwegian level of public acceptance has definitely been lowered the last decade, or more than the last decade, you could say. There are a lot of reasoning as to why that is, both concerning the way the process was really handled and how rapid it went, but also, the distribution of the costs and benefits. And a lot of citizens we see also simply will not accept the negative externalities in terms of nature degradation that comes with building any kinds of infrastructure, you could say, but especially wind turbines, as this has become a polarized issue. My most recent research also shows that Norway is a bit of an outlier in terms of opposition in the public being high towards especially foreign ownership and purely talking about exports, right? Really framing this as being export-driven. And we do see that this is driven by, you could say, broader sentiments in the public when it comes to, you can see, a rise in nationalism, or at least economic nationalism, which is what we covered here. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's so interesting. Julia, do we have questions?
Yes, we have quite a few actually. And I think 3 or 4. First, I would like to give you a short chance to clarify regarding the questionnaire. And the question is, how and where was the questionnaire distributed?
Yes, thank you. Good question. So again, this is an online, the first questionnaire with the Norwegian Citizens Panel. As mentioned, that is an online survey panel. So you recruit actually from the Norwegian national registries to really get us an as representative panel as possible. So this is as close as we get to really saying something about the shares of support and opposition in the Norwegian population. We do also use survey weights, which really do something to balance out whatever biases might be in terms of perhaps higher educated citizens answering these surveys more and so forth. So that was that. And then the other survey was fielded through Norstat, the latter survey with the 4 countries, was fielded through Norstat, also with approximately representative panels. And when it's not representative, we again use survey weights to balance out to get us an as equal mirror of the population as possible.
Yeah. Thank you. And then we had 2 questions a bit touching upon each other regarding discussion of options. Mm-hmm. So the first question was, with energy supply deficit in the south of Norway, which new technology deployment has public support, if not wind power? And I'm going to read the second, and then you can mix it all together. Is there any discussion of options? Why more wind energy is needed? If not wind, what is the alternative, and what could be the consequences of different paths? So both in terms of if other technology deployment has public support, but also perhaps touch upon the discussion of options and maybe also the consequences.
Great, thank you. Great questions. So in Norway, we see that support is today very high for hydropower. And of course, there's limits to how much you can do more with the hydropower we have. But support is very high, actually, for developing more where you can, and also, of course, upgrading the existing hydroelectric dams. So that's like the easy out, you could say. Support is quite high also for solar panels as of now. It's a bit lower than hydropower, but support is quite high for solar panels, higher for that than, for example, building battery factories, which some colleagues have also looked into. And then we haven't in our design looked into nuclear power, but that is, of course, especially amongst those the most opposed. I'm also doing some studies with organizations that are opposing wind power in Norway, and the go-to solution, other than energy efficiency and Norway don't need more renewable energy, which is actually a quite common framework to use with this idea that Norway has so much hydropower. Why would we need to generate more electricity to export it to Germany? That's a standard kind of viewpoint, I would say. You do see, nuclear power kind of rising up as an alternative, at least in the public debates. That is, yeah.
Thank you. We have a few more. Is it okay that I continue?
Okay. Yes.
So this question is regarding the substantial reduction in public support after 2019. And the question is, if you think it's due to the NVE proposed plan for onshore wind, which retracted later. That's the question.
I definitely think it can be related. Again, this would, in that sense, have more to do with how the public really handles, what is in the media, right? Because a lot of the question here is, it's one thing. I like to separate a bit. You have local opposition, which is often quite. Then you're close to these projects and you see kind of the benefits and the costs, perhaps. But when you see such as here, that you have polarization really at such a public level in the whole population. I do think the way this has been handled in terms of media attention and also NVE's reports does play a role. Yes, I do so. Yeah.
And then, I think I can go on, right? Looking at
you can. I'm looking at my watch, and you can still go on.
So, do you think fossil fuel producers have any role in influencing or manipulating public opinion against wind power in Norway?
No, I mean, my guess, if anything, would be no, and my impression would be that no. Equinor, for example, is one of the stakeholders trying to develop offshore wind and has been active in that. So I don't get that impression. No.
All right, thank you. And then we had a bit of I would say, a bit more sort of statistically related question regarding the questionnaire. Yeah. But perhaps you could take that during the break and approach Marte. And then again, I know you're with the Department of Comparative Politics, so perhaps this could be of interest.
She's also studied the same thing. Yep.
So why is export and trading with Sweden more accepted than exporting to Denmark? Is there too big of a focus on Oslo prices?
That is a good question, and I do think, of course, there are way more nuances to this export question than what we have in this kind of simple design, which is designed really to grasp, these more general attitudes. So yes, there is a lot of focus on certain areas and electricity prices, you could say, and also not so much attention perhaps on how much money or revenue has been generated by export of electricity from Norway. Norway is a big exporter after all. So, I mean, the short answer would be yes, perhaps there is too much attention to certain areas. Yeah.
And then perhaps, even though we have plenty more, maybe a last one, I think.
Yeah.
And I guess this is up to you to answer, but what is your own position on wind after studying the subject? Smiley face or winking eyes in the question.
My own position on wind. Well, I think it is enlightening for sure to, perhaps it's one thing with these public attitudes, but it is interesting to speak to people at the local level who do experience these processes as being so deeply unfair. So while of course, as I'm sure most in this room, I'm very aware we need a green transition and more renewable energy also in Norway. And wind power is, per now, the most cost-efficient alternative. I do think it is very important to take these concerns seriously and not resort to, simple characterizations of, oh, not in my backyardism, and they don't understand that we need this energy, because there are a lot of really real concerns out there, which I think is important to take into account when you pursue these developments. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. So there are plenty more questions, but we can look at them during the break and discuss them. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Marte.
Thank you.